Hello, Clara Daly. Very interesting to meet you here in virtual space. You are a member of the European Parliament. It's okay? This is okay?
Yeah, that's right. I'm an Irish member of the European Parliament elected from the Dublin constituency in the last European elections.
Mm-hmm. And you are engaged also with Eurasia, or it's not special theme for you?
No,
Because I want to ask you about Kazakhstan.
Not especially for me. I mean, previously I was a member of the Irish Parliament for a number of years, and international affairs are very important to me. I also am a firm believer in peace and in the need to have good relations. So given the growing Russophobia and anti-Chinese rhetoric in the European Union, I found myself having to speak out on these subjects, maybe a lot more than would naturally be my brief.
So the first question, what was your feelings when you heard about the protests in Kazakhstan, which began on the 2nd of January?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have to say, like a lot of people in Europe and probably a lot of European politicians, my knowledge of Kazakhstan is pretty limited. Where I would have heard about it before was around the time of the putting down of the movement in Zhanozin 10 or 11 years ago, and the murders of activists there. I would be familiar with that history. I would also be aware of the influence of money of the oligarchic families from Kazakhstan and how it infiltrated into the city of London and became very involved there. So I had a certain knowledge of Kazakhstan being a country which had a lot of problems, a lot of wealth in terms of natural resources, but that though the benefit of those natural resources not being shared equally amongst the population, but rather hijacked and utilized in a way in which to benefit a minority at the top of that society, and for that wealth to be very much brought center stage in the capitalist economies of London and the US and so on. So that was my knowledge. So when I heard of the protests, I suppose I was surprised, given that you don't hear anything at all about Kazakhstan. The backdrop of it would seem to be the fuel hike crisis announced by the government, which would cause an awful lot of problems for the citizens, many of whom were probably struggling anyway. So yeah, I found it, I suppose initially the scale of it quite surprising, but the root causes of the idea of the inequality there, I would have a certain, I suppose, knowledge of or sympathy for from the disputes maybe 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And you're a left, people from a left. And what is your feeling? I mean, in Russia, we have the left is divided, and one part is acquaintance is support the delivering of Russian troops in Kazakhstan, and the other part, because it's no the argumentation that it's necessary to make stability there. The other part of the left is strictly against, because they said there was a working movement with correct demands, and why Russian soldiers should defend an oligarch system. And I think it's a normal thing to talk about this. Perhaps you have also an opinion.
Well, and I think that's really interesting, because I would have to say that the left in Europe is undoubtedly going to be divided on it as well in the EU. They usually are on everything, but it has come up in Ireland already, where we've seen some people on the left move very quickly to categorize the movement as being solely one of a workers' revolt. And responding in support of that, as any good left-winger would. We do support the idea of decent living standards and support workers in struggle. But for me, their response was very categorical to say any talk of outside interference or any talk of terrorist forces was a nonsense for which there was no foundation. And they moved very quickly to condemn Russia's involvement and so on. And for me, that was a little bit odd, because it seemed more like trying to hijack the narrative rather than try and explain in a comradely and in the interests of proper solidarity how people should respond to this issue. So I think there are divisions there. I mean, the letter which some groups in the left circulated in Ireland and across Europe and indeed internationally was very much being critical of Russia and China in particular, condemning the US and the EU for kind of saying, oh, there should be restraint on all sides. But to me, it was a little bit too categorical in saying that this was a simple case of a people's revolt against a rotten ruling elite. I've no doubt that that narrative is a big part of what's gone on in Kazakhstan. But I think given the speed at which events developed, the scale of the violence that occurred and the seemingly scale of the looting seemed to be unusual for a mass people's revolt and the speed of that. So I think it's probably true to say that there are many narratives, that there are probably behind all of this, there is disputes amongst, say, the ruling oligarchs and their enemies inside of Kazakhstan. I've no doubt that there is probably terrorist or foreign interference people at play here as well. That doesn't diminish that there's legitimate concerns by the population either. And Russia's involvement is a whole different, I suppose, story then into the mix. I mean, I suppose the first thing to say that it's a bit rich from the European Union, who didn't care anything about the rights of the people of Kazakhstan at all, basically let the initial peace movement pass them by without a comment. And they only became exorcised and interested when the Collective Security Treaty Organization forces were assembled and called in to intervene. Suddenly then they became very interested about what was happening in Kazakhstan. And to me, that reflected the fact that many European and Western industries have benefited very well from themselves personally and their shareholders, enriching themselves off the backs of the resources of Kazakhstan through many of these competing oligarchic families. And they're quite happy, I suppose, to keep the status quo in that sense. But at the same time, then they don't want to see Russia improving its position in the area, or they want to see it as another plank at which to put the pressure on Russia, who are obviously presently engaged in the talks around the Ukraine and that. So I think it's interesting you say the left is divided in Russia. It certainly would be across Europe as well in relation to these matters. But to me, I think it would be naive, as they have to categorize this as just a simple people's movement against oligarchs. I'd say there's more at play in this, even though that is undoubtedly a huge part of the narrative. It's not the only thing at play.
Can you explain which letter circulated now in Europe? You talk about a letter of the left.
Yeah, it was an initiative sparked by a member of Parliament in Ireland from the, I suppose, Trotskyist tradition in Ireland, a group called People Before Profit. It was circulated. I don't know how broadly. We were asked to co-sign it. I've seen a list where maybe 200 people have signed it from across the world, but I think they would be generally union activists and in some instances elected representatives of those broad Trotskyist groups.
And they criticize military involvement of Russia in Kazakhstan.
Very strong, and China were being singled out.
But China, what China?
I know. I don't know. I think China said made a statement in favor of. I'm not sure what China was supposed to have done. To be honest, whether China had made a favorable comment about Tokayev or something, I don't know. But yeah, they were particularly singled out, which I didn't think was helpful, you know.
But when you compare the reaction of the English mass media, Irish mass media to the situation in Belarus and now in Kazakhstan? Is there a big difference? I mean, I have the impression that the information about Kazakhstan is not very, very big in Europe now.
No, and it's completely kind of receded off the headlines a little bit. I mean, originally when it sort of burst onto the scene, the attention wasn't sufficient. Then, as I say, an interest became in it when the CSTO troops were moved in. The narrative was then marshaled in the context of Russian involvement. So it was framed not in the interests of the people of Kazakhstan, but about, oh, this is Russia now again muscling in on a neighbor. And we saw the statements by Blinken and that saying, oh, Russia's neighbors would want to be very careful. Once they move in, they don't move out. Now, this is from a country that has 850 bases in 90 countries, who the parliament in Iraq voted for US troops to get out, and they haven't got out of their country. So a bit rich, the US lecture and everybody else, but the media focused on Russia's involvement,
but
what is the nuances of it. But since then,
what is the reason? What is the reason that mass media don't react very strong to Kazakhstan, the situation in Kazakhstan, but strong react to Belarus situation?
Well, I mean, look at this.
I mean, refugee, the crisis with refugees in the winter now. There was a big reaction in German media and I think in English also, Irish perhaps also. But why this is more important for the West than Kazakhstan? But we see Kazakhstan. Yes.
I think we can't divorce the response on this issue from the whole approach of the media, generally what we would call, I suppose, the mainstream media across the EU, which they may not see it like this, but they very much pursue an Atlanticist agenda and the influence of the United States in trying to, I suppose, curtail any independent EU position that is somehow different from US influence, infiltrates all of the media through the various US think tanks, which are dominant across the continent and so on. And so we have this narrative which has been really ratcheted up. I mean, particularly in the past number of years, I found it utterly striking the way in which now Russia is being demonized at every turn. And I think in that sense, the change in the coverage is that Belarus is being very much portrayed as being protected by Russia, whereas Kazakhstan is maybe a little bit more nuanced because the West has very big commercial interests in Kazakhstan, and the oligarchs and the big foreign companies have benefited massively and profited from those countries. So they don't want to rock that boat in Kazakhstan, whereas they don't have the same link in Belarus. So it's easy then to kind of play that card and say, oh, well, Belarus is more covered because they're a Russian puppet or a protectorate of Putin or whatever, because the commercial interests are not as deep from the Western economies in Belarus as they would be in Kazakhstan. To me, that's the only explanation that you could draw from that situation. I mean, we know that the oligarchs there have been wined and dined in the city of London. Their paws and their money is all over the place, So
I know. Today I heard that a person whose name is Kulibayev, he's a big oligarch in Kazakhstan. He is the owner of a transport system for the stations where the fuel come in the cars, and he has a big house in London, or on the outskirts of London.
Oh, many of the different competing oligarchs, because there have been fallouts and conflict between the different families and their offspring, and we're talking about billions and billions of euros wealth which was creamed off, which should be the property of the people of Kazakhstan, but it has been cleaned, as it were, and has found its way into companies listed on the London Stock Exchange, It has been transformed into property and businesses, very integrated in the Western capitalist economies, and wealthy companies have benefited massively from these projects. So they're very much in. In many instances, the leaderships in Kazakhstan were lauded and wined and dined by the Western powers as being the great anti-Stalinist, post-communist leaders who were trying to, you know, make their countries fit for capitalism kind of thing, you know, and they were seen as fertile ground to profit from. And these were individuals that the West could talk to, because while they were lining their own pockets, they were also lining the pockets of many people in Western Europe as well.
But what is your point of view? There was a movement of in the whole Kazakhstan, in many cities, and on the street where what people were on the street, normal people, working people, also union members. And what do you think? What was it? A spontaneous movement, and some Russian said it was a revolution, something like a revolution. And what will be after this? I mean, what will be the development in the next months, and what does it mean for the whole all the countries with Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Russia also? I mean, this is really such things we haven't in the last years, and so this is very important to know.
And I think many of these questions are very difficult to answer, obviously. I mean, we've seen kind of attempted revolts before, or sort of short uprisings, which then kind of fall back into normal. But after this, things will not be the same, clearly. But what they will be is harder to say. The full implications of it, I don't know. It would seem, from looking on from the outskirts, and my opinion is only my opinion, is that there were certainly large-scale and very genuine outpouring by the citizens of Kazakhstan, which is not easy to do in a country which is pretty authoritarian, you know. It was obvious that the state forces couldn't control what had happened. It was, so I suppose in that sense, for people looking on, they would see that their own state was quite weak. Whether that was the product of a coup, as has been portrayed, or that certain individuals utilizing elements of the state forces for their own benefit, is that part of the narrative? Maybe it is. It doesn't take from the fact that the citizens themselves went onto the streets and demanded justice. Obviously, the cases of the reports of the scale of the violence, how quickly it moved into people using guns against the police and so on, the footage of individuals who seem to be very experienced in combat protesting. All of these things, I think, are not accidental. It doesn't mean that the protests weren't genuine, but it does mean that other elements probably moved in to take advantage of those protests. I would believe that that is the case. Now, what is the dominant trend in that? I don't know, but all of those, there's going to be a fallout from that. I mean, I believe there's now going to be an investigation into the events that happened. Whether that will be an independent investigation that has the confidence of the Kazakhstan people in its findings, I don't know. I mean, obviously, initially, when the fuel hike was reversed and a new government put in place, or a new whatever cabinet put in place, it didn't quell the protests. So people, I think, would be demanding more fundamental change. Tokayev has said he will now look at the economic conditions that people are facing, that there will have to be an improvement in living standards and so on. I think these will be necessary. That will have to be delivered upon to satisfy the people and the unions, I would imagine. Then, of course, there's the other side. There are many people in prison. I mean, 8,000 people or whatever has been said who are in prison. That's a very large scale clampdown, like, you know, and there's no way that there's 8,000 terrorists involved in this. Many ordinary citizens, I'm sure, have probably been caught up in that. So there's going to be a fallout from that as well, like, you know. So, you know, we saw what happened 10 years ago when the movement was crushed and people were killed. I don't think this is a replica of that. I think lessons will have been learned from that. But I suppose one of the concerns is that it may now be seized upon as another flank to sort of put pressure on Russia, because I think there probably were, and I can understand why, discussions in Russian society about whether Russia should be involved at all. In many ways, if they withdraw, which it's been said they will withdraw very quickly, I think that would be a good thing, because then they would have demonstrated that they could respond quickly, cohesively, and in a disciplined manner, and that would allay any fears that there was an ulterior motive involved. I think that would be good if that happened. But yeah, I mean, long term, if it's seen as another area which is close to Russia's borders, which is being destabilized, is something that I would imagine Russians will be very worried about.
Is there any initiative from you or from your fraction in the European Parliament, in this case, some special demands, what is necessary now to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult. I mean, I think there should be open relations with everybody there. I mean, the idea of trying to get as much information as possible. I would certainly, I'm not in favor of people who are in protest being imprisoned or incarcerated or all of this. We would have certainly like to see transparency around those cases and the investigation into this process. We would very much support the need for living standards to be raised in Kazakhstan, not as outside people dictating, but supporting the demands of Kazakhstan citizens themselves. It's very clear that this is a wealthy country with wealthy natural resources.
Is there any idea to go to Kazakhstan from your faction or some?
It hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think that will inevitably be raised, and I think that would be a good thing, to organise a mission visit and to go and try and meet as many people as possible, but not just the select few on one side, but being open to meeting people on all sides of the argument. So I think it would be good to go to meet the miners, to go and meet the protesters, but also to go to meet the representatives of the new cabinet, I suppose, security forces and so on. I think that would be worthwhile. But my problem is that the EU generally goes to these areas as a sort of it's their sort of modern day colonialism, which they can't shake off, to tell people in these countries what to do. I don't think it can really pose itself as a neutral arbiter to go in and say, because there are vested interests there. But I do think the left and trade unionists and citizens across Europe, or their public representatives, should seek to go in and engage with different sectors of the society, because these countries, the former Soviet states, are ones that we never really hear about in the Western media at all. And then when we do, it's in a very one-dimensional way. So I think it would be very beneficial to develop links with no preconceived notions about what we are going to find there.
Tony Blair was over many years advisor of President Nazarbayev. Now Nazarbayev, nobody knows where he is. He is alive or not? It's also a question. What does it mean? I mean, Tony Blair and English business is also very engaged in gas and oil in Kazakhstan. What do you think? What responsibility or guilty, perhaps also, for this situation? Why democratic standards are not very high in Kazakhstan?
Well, this is the perennial question around Tony Blair. I mean, this is a disgusting war criminal, let's be clear about it, who has just been knighted by the British. I mean, this person is absolutely reprehensible in all of his dealing, not least in lying to the British public about the Iraq war. He's been responsible for war crimes, and yet it's Julian Assange who's in prison in the UK. So double standards are totally prevalent. His role in advising the Nazarbayev for his own or his foundation's financial gain. I mean, let's be clear now, Tony Blair or his projects benefit to the tunes of millions from their relationship with the Kazakhstan oligarchy. We know, and I've read the letters even before now, of his advice given in the talk before the British University in response to the last outrage in Zhanosian, where Blair advised him to, yes, you know, tackle the human rights abuses head on. Say you get that, you're learning that you're only new developing a society, that it takes time to bring in change. And this is the disgusting mantra that this individual has profited from. And as you say, that many UK companies have benefited from. But for them, this was their opportunity to line their own pockets from the pilferage of state resources in Kazakhstan by rotten individuals at the top of Kazakhstan society, and they became their henchmen. And yet they talk about democracy and delivering freedom for the people of Kazakhstan, and how it was a great thing now that Kazakhstan was entering the capitalist world. Clearly not, because the economic problems and divisions in Kazakhstan are alive and well, and the people didn't benefit from the resources of their country. So hypocrisy is the hallmark of the European Union. I know Britain are now out of the European Union, but they still bear that responsibility as well. It's despicable. It really is. And I mean, the role of Kazakhstan money in the city of London is immense. I mean, there have been books written about it, about its trail. It is filtered in everywhere.
Do you agree with the opinion that the West is hoping that Tokayev or perhaps another person in Kazakhstan would make good relations with the West in the manner the West like? I mean, and perhaps even better than now. I mean, perhaps, I don't know. Could it be such hope in the West?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do. I mean, I think their paws are everywhere. There's plenty of foreign NGO think tank type operators existing in the country who will be certainly looking for opportunities to benefit the Western influence, I suppose. So yes, they may hope that. I mean, certainly there are widespread commercial interests in the natural resources that are there in Kazakhstan. So they would very much, as the European Union always does, be very keen to get their paws on that. If it could have the added advantage of developing close cooperation with another country on Russia's border, they would be up for that as well. So I think they would be hoping that that's the case. And maybe if that wasn't the case, a destabilized country near Russia's border, they probably wouldn't have a huge problem with that either. But I think the difficulty for them in this one is that they already have economic interests there that they will want protected somewhat. But, you know, in all of these dealings, there comes a time when you have such a corrupt elite, I suppose, running societies and profiting so much from economies that sometimes that becomes toxic, and they have to ditch their favorite henchman in a country, maybe in return for a different one. But I suppose it's too early to say how that will actually pan out. And Tokayev may have to say to them, listen, lads, if you want to keep doing business here, you've profited loads from this, you're going to have to cough up with a bit more in terms of the wages and conditions of some of the workers in these plants and mines and so on.
Okay, thank you very much for the talk.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an incredibly interesting situation, and I would imagine that I'm not alone in not being educated enough in these issues, but I think it is the responsibility of all of us in the European Union to try and find out more and not just take that narrative from either the EEAS or the establishment media in the European Union.